Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Haggadah in Depth. This is the 46th continuous episode. Tonight's Torah teaching on the Haggadah continues to unpack the mechanics of bitterness, also known as Maror. This is the 9th segment of the order of the Seder. And this episode is called Dip, Shake, Bless. We're going to be looking into why we dip the Maror in the Charoset, and then after dipping it, we shake everything off. What's the point? If you're dipping it inside, you want it to taste like it. Imagine dipping your French fries in ketchup and then shaking all the ketchup off. Well, then why would you dip it to begin with? We're also going to talk about what intention should be accompanying the bracha before we eat, and it's actually a little bit more than you think. I'm going to give you a brief outline of what we're going to be doing this evening. And the reason that I'm going to do this is because a lot of the material is a little bit arcane and maybe a tad bit challenging. I'm going to ask everybody here to please stop me if I lose you. If I didn't say something wasn't clear, please stop me and it'll give me the chance to explain it to you again. We're basically going to be addressing a number of major points. And the major points are, we're going to talk about the purpose of dipping Maror and the Charoset, and you're going to hear some very novel things. It's a part of Judaism that changed. That's rare. We almost never change anything. And we're going to appreciate two dimensions in Charoset. We're going to hear about a Charoset that is solid, and then a Charoset that gets adjusted, or like kind of liquefied before its use. We're going to be exploring that. We're going to talk about the requirement to shake off the Charoset, and why that's a halachically sound thing to do, like what's at stake. We're also going to be talking about a change, as I mentioned earlier, a change that happened from the way Charoset used to be used to the way Charoset is used in today's day and age. It's a fairly recent change. And we're going to be focused on the preservation of the bitter taste. We're going to talk about the role that intention plays in this specific bracha. This is an idea we're going to talk about later on, perhaps in greater detail, but this is very pragmatic and important. And I think if I want to use overarching terminology, I'm going to tell you that at this class you're going to walk away with a deeper appreciation of the halachic structure, as well as the spiritual meaning behind the details of this step of the order of the Haggadah. Before we begin our actual study, I just want to thank our sponsorship. Tonight's class has been dedicated by Ira and Alan Hetz, and the great-grandmother Lily Rips on the birth of the 4th grandson and great-grandson that was born on the yahrzeit of his late Elta Zedi, Reb Paul Henry Rips, Olav Shalom, whose name happened to be Pesach. Anyway, here's the Shamash Rav and Aliyah. Paul Henry Rips is a beautiful Yid, a Holocaust survivor, who really lived with a sense of Pesach and liberation and gratitude to Hashem as he rebuilt his life after the war. I'm going to direct you, if you want to follow along, you can go to page 40 in the Haggadahs that I distributed, and you'll see under Maror that we get a little bit of an explanation here. Right? You see in the English, there's a translation of the Alter Rebbe's instructions. He says, now you take a kezayit of Maror, you dip it into the Charoset, then you shake off the Charoset that's stuck to it so that the bitter taste will not be neutralized, and you recite the following blessing. That's the instructions. Maybe it helps to ground you if you look inside the Haggadah. We are going to focus on the dipping in the Charoset. That's going to be the major focus, the dipping, the shaking, and the bracha. Right? Dip, shake, bless. In our previous episode, where we started, we opened the mechanics of bitterness. We talked about Maror itself. Where's the origin of this obligation? Why do we do it? We talked about when we dip and when we make the bracha. All of this has already been covered. That we covered in our previous episode. So we'll take it from the words v'yitbol b'charoset. We dip the maror which, as we learned, in today's day and age is a rabbinic mitzvah. We dip the maror into the charoset. In the Rebbe's annotation, the Rebbe writes the following. I'm going to read to you from the Rebbe's commentary, tell you what it means, and then we're going to delve into this and try to understand what the Rebbe's what he's telling us. V'kodem hatvila, before you dip the maror in the charoset, merachech hacharoset, we have to soften or liquefy, loosen the charoset beyayin shebetoch keli, wine which is in the vessel or in a vessel. And the Alter Rebbe cites the Shulchan Aruch of the Alter Rebbe, chapter 473, Siman Tov Ayin Gimel, Seifim Lamed Beis, Lamed Gimel, and Lamed Daled, subsection 32, 33, and 34. Now, it's interesting to note that in the instructions, it doesn't say anything about this. It doesn't say that we do this. We need to do it. The Rebbe says we need to do it. And this is done before we dip the maror in the charoset. So let's try to understand what's going on here. In order to appreciate what's going on over here, the first thing I want to do to you is introduce the words of the Talmud Yerushalmi. This is found in the 10th chapter of Masechet Pesachim of the Talmud Yerushalmi. It is in the third halacha, the end of the third halacha. And it will be an explanation of what charoset is. And when we understand what charoset is, we'll understand why we should be adding wine to the charoset. And when we'll understand what the charoset is there for, and why we should be adding wine, we will then be able to understand how and why we dip, how that differs from the way the dip used to happen, and why we shake off the charoset after we dip the maror inside. I mean, after all, if you're dipping the maror inside, why shake it off? Either don't dip it, or if you dip it, like keep it on. What's the point of dipping and then shaking off? So the Gemara, the Talmud Yerushalmi says, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Amar, Tzricha Shatei Ove. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi taught the charoset has to have a thick consistency. Why is this? So the Gemara says, Milsei Amra, from this we can understand, from his teaching, we're able to derive that the purpose of the charoset is a zecher letit. We do it as a zecher, a remembrance of the mortar. Right? We have bricks and mortar. So there was clay and mortar. So we want to remember the clay and the mortar. That's what the Gemara says. Then we introduce an opposing view. The Talmud Yerushalmi continues. It says, Is Tanoye, there are those who learned a little bit differently. Tanoye, Tani, they learned differently. And how did these Tanoim learn it? How did they learn it? Tzricha, they said, Shetahei Raka, that the charoset has to not be thick like clay, but the charoset has to be thin, like liquid. It has to be it has to be a very thin consistency, not a solid consistency. Milsei Amra, from this we're able to derive or understand that Zecher Ladam, that the purpose of the Charoset is as a remembrance of the blood. So a remembrance of the clay or a remembrance of the blood. These are the two different opinions that we see in the Talmud Yerushalmi. If you look in the commentary of the Korban Ha'eda, he says, Shetahei Raka, this idea that it has to be thin, Zeichel Adam, it reminds us of the blood. Now, it's not water. Have you heard the expression blood is thicker than water? Right? Plasma has a thickness to it, but it still flows. So it's a flowing substance. It's not a solid substance, but it's a dense, it's a thick substance. So the Korban Ha'eda says, Shahayu sheikin betit al hayilodim aktanim, that the idea is that the Egyptians would cement babies into the walls if there was a shortage in the quota of bricks that were produced. So there was literally blood running into the mortar. The mortar was drenched with the blood of Jewish children. And this is how they tormented the Jewish people. So that's according to the Korban HaEdah, this is a remembrance of our suffering. It's a remembrance of our suffering. That's remembering the blood. The Pnei Moshe, however, has a very different approach. The Pnei Moshe says that the idea of Zeichel Edom reminds us not of the subjugation and the suffering and the slavery, but instead it reminds us of the process of redemption, the acts of liberation. How does it all begin? With the plagues. The plagues dismantle the might of Egypt until Egypt is on its knees. What was the first plague? Dam. So that's what he says. That's what the Pnei Moshe says. Zeichel Edom, Maka Harishona, the first of the plagues, Shabo Aleihem, which came upon them. Now, the Pnei Moshe is not discounting what the Korban HaEdah says. In fact, the Medrash is very clear about babies being abducted from their parents and forced into the spaces that were left when there wasn't enough bricks, where there was an empty quota of bricks. But that's not the focus. That's not the focus. And the Pnei Moshe says that the concept of the Makkah of Dam was a midah keneged midah, a measure that corresponded to a measure. So there was a measure of cruelty where the Egyptians were murdering these babies, and their blood was running into the mud, into the clay. And according to another approach, another understanding, the Charoset, in impersonating blood or seeming like blood, reminds us that the Pharaoh would slaughter Jewish children and then he would bathe in their blood. And that's the midah keneged midah. But the midah keneged midah, the emphasis for us is to remember not the suffering, the emphasis for us in creating a charoset, which is blood-like, which resembles plasma, is to remember the concept of the Nile River turning into blood, and old water turning into blood. Now, I just want to point out, it's not really what this is about, but there are a number of details that we find in the Seder where there's things which are meant to mimic the concept of blood, because that was the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Unfortunately, our enemies concocted these blood libels against us. And one of the things that they came up with was that Jewish people are abducting Christian children, slaughtering the children, and using their blood in matzah. And they said, look, you see, it's supposed to, Charoset is blood, the wine is blood, and there's an emphasis on using red wine. There's actually an emphasis on using red wine, even though there's a big machlokas, a big dispute amongst the Rishonim, whether we have to use red wine for Kiddush or white wine. Nachmanides strongly opines that wine should always be red, ideally. Many other Rishonim disagree. And the Alter Rebbe says you don't have to be specific. It doesn't, for a regular Kiddush, the Alter Rebbe paskins, white wine, if that's what you like, that's fine. But when it comes to the night of Pesach, there is an emphasis on red wine. Having said this, there was a time in history, and it's cited in the Shulchan Aruch, where the rabbi said maybe it's a better idea to start using white wine. Why? Because of the blood libels that they made up against us. Right? And today we understand this, unfortunately, and tragically we understand this very, very well, where we have our enemies who are literally concocting blood libels in full view of a world where there's an explosion of information, and anybody who wants to know anything is able to know the truth. And yet, even today, the mayor of New York, I will say Yamach Shemo, got up and he spoke about a genocide. It's entirely a blood libel. It's an awful situation. War is hell. That's not us who say holy war. That's not a Jewish thing. It's a horrible thing. War is a hellish thing. There's moral wars. And when you have monsters who do what they did on October 7th, and you have no choice but to destroy the terrorist apparatus that openly says we plan to do this again and again and again. They say it openly. And they embed themselves among civilians, and civilians die. It's tragic. Well, whose fault is it? The answer is Hamas. It's not a genocide, it's war. It's war that Israel doesn't start. And yet, it just rolls off Mamdani's lips with a smile, an evil smile on his face. Rolls off his lips today. Came to our St. Patrick's celebration and can't help himself from pointing an accusing finger, making up a blood libel about the Jewish people. So this is just a modern example of we hear these stories of Jewish history. So how could people say such crazy things that we would abduct children and we take their blood? A Jew is not allowed to eat blood. How could you imagine such a thing? Today it's not so hard to imagine how, because we see this actually, unfortunately, sickeningly, see it tragically happen. Anyway, the bottom line is that from this Gemara we have what seems to be a dual personality of Charoset. On one hand, Charoset is supposed to be thick like mortar or clay. On the other hand, the Charoset is supposed to be thin, denser than water, but it's supposed to be like thin with a liquid consistency that resembles plasma. Plasma, of course, is thick. It's thick in comparison to regular liquid, but it's thin when you compare it to something which is clay-like. It doesn't look like tissue. It looks like that's what this idea is. That's what the dual personality. That's the origin. This is what the Talmud Yerushalmi says. Okay. Now, I'm skipping a little bit because I want to be able to cover ground tonight. But I wanted to introduce you to the original source. This is the oldest source we have. The source is the Talmud Yerushalmi. This is taking us back almost 18 centuries. We hear clear the Talmud's articulating these two different schools of thought as to what the Charoset is supposed to look like. There is an explanation, and there are different customs. There's a Tosfos. There's a Tosfos on Daf Kuf Tezayin, which spells out the Tosfos on the Gemara on page 116. The Tosfos spells out actually what the different ingredients are. Many an episode ago, we focused on that. If you go back to the early episodes, you'll find the ingredients in the Charoset. It's in there. We're not going to focus on that tonight. But the point now is not, it's also in some of the recent Talmud class, the Talmudish classes from 2 or 3 years ago. I also focused a lot on Charoset, and you can find a discussion of that. Okay, now, when we use Charoset, what is the purpose of the Charoset? Why do we have this Charoset? And is the Charoset supposed to be clay, meaning thick, like mortar? Or is the Charoset supposed to be thin, like plasma? Can you have both? Well, that's a wonderful suggestion. Can we have both? So let's see what the Torah says. Let's go to the Torah. I mean, there's endless sources, but I wanted to give you just the basic halachic sources. So the Torah says like this. Charoses, this is the Torah Siman Taf Ayin Gimel, chapter 473 of Orach Chaim. V'hacharoses, says the Torah, commenting on the Charoses, Hu zecher letit. This is a remembrance of the clay. Now I want to interject for a moment here. Why are we making remembrances of clay and remembrances of plasma, blood? Why are we making remembrances? So this dovetails into something which we talked about many times, and we'll come back to it in future episodes. The major focus on this night is to tell the story. The eternity of the Jewish people is embodied in the Pesach Seder. The Pesach Seder is something that we, the Jewish people, have observed generation after generation, century upon century, for millennia. So if we don't find archaeological evidence of Moshe Rabbeinu's shoes, or maybe our own staff, this is not like a concern to us. They say, well, where's the archaeological evidence? Show me the hard evidence. I want to see Moses' bust. Do you find this? No bust, that's it, no Moses. Never happened. The statistical possibilities of having a story that is told year after year after year by every single Jew. It's not told somewhere in a synagogue. Every Jewish home, every single Jewish home, all parents and children, everywhere in the world. And there are all kinds of Jewish people. There are Jewish people who lived in the northern areas of Europe, and there were Jewish people who were living in Eurasia. People living everywhere. There are black Jews and green Jews and blue Jews. The Jews of Yemen who look Yemeni, and the Jews of Norway who look Scandinavian. And yet, all of these Jews are all telling the same story. The Chinese Jews, we have a Haggadah preserved. The Indian Jews, they're telling the same. Ethiopian Jews, they're telling the same story. When did the story of going out of Mitzrayim start? When did the Haggadah start? That's a good question. So the actual text of the Haggadah, the body of the Haggadah that we have today, has an unknown author, and it's documented in Talmudic times, in the Mishnah times. So in the era of the Mishnah, we know that the Haggadah was already in place. Interestingly enough, this helps us to date the Chinese Jewish community. Why? Because they have a Haggadah. If they have a Haggadah, they must be for the time of the Mishnah. Not as others ridiculously suggested that they are the lost 10 tribes. They wouldn't have a Haggadah then.
So the Haggadah came really way after Matan Torah.
The formal text of the Haggadah comes at a later time when Jewish people started to formulate texts, to have actual formal texts. What happened in the beginning was everybody told a story.
So when the Torah says, remember the day
I'm going to talk about this. Yeah, V'higadat levincha. How do you remember? I mean, the first generation told the story to their children. They said, this is what we experienced.
first generation.
Yeah. And the second generation said, this is what our parents told us. And then the next generation said, this is what my Babi and Zaidi said. This is what Saba and Savta, Awella or Awella, however they called it. And then the next generation said, yeah, my elders, I remember. There was a few people who still remember the old people from back there. By the way, for the first 350, 400 years after the Jewish people came into the land of Israel, there were still some very old people. There were people who lived a very long life. There was a fellow named Achia Hashiloni who only rises to prominence in the era of King David. He became a great Torah teacher after David HaMelech. And he was a child who left Egypt. And he wasn't the only one. So there were people who experienced extraordinary longevity. So a few centuries after Yetzias Mitzrayim, there were still some people telling the story as they had remembered it happening. And they told us annually. They never got to forget the story because they told it every year. It's a mitzvah to tell the story. And it's a mitzvah to tell the story to your children. So yeah, at a certain point, they formalized the text that we followed. Just like once upon a time, prayer was not formalized. Everybody would pray. People would daven. They would pray on a regular basis. Not in the Maimonides. Rambam says it's a mitzvah saseh. It's a positive mitzvah in the Torah to daven, to pray every single day. We didn't have a Seder. No, of course we didn't have a Seder. The Seder is older, by the way, than all of the world religions. The Seder is 26 centuries old. But we didn't have a Seder before that. However, the phraseology of davening goes back to the time of the patriarchs. Like the prayer of Goel Yisrael is before Rifa'inu was composed by Yosef HaTzadik when he was in prison, for example. So we have very early records of how the prayers came together and formulated, but the Siddur, as we know it, more or less, that's Anshe Knesset Haggadah, that's the post-Purim era.
Was the story in the same order as the Haggadah? Or
That's an excellent question. That's an excellent question, Mark. The story was not in a very structured way in the beginning. Just like davening, just like prayers were not very structured. And at a certain point, things became structured. But even though things became structured only at a certain point, it doesn't mean was at that point we started telling the story. The same story was told. For example, there are two schools of thought as to how the Haggadah should begin. Should the Haggadah begin by talking about the maschel begnus? Should we talk about our lowly beginnings? Right, that's one opinion. And another opinion has a very different approach, that we shouldn't talk about lowly beginnings. So what do? We start the Haggadah twice. Haggadah actually has two starts in the structure as we use it. So it's the different schools of thought, Torah schools of thought. The Haggadah, as we have it, is relatively young, about 22, 23 centuries old. That's relatively young. That's Haggadah as we have it. But all Jews are telling the same story. Nobody has a different story. There's no two stories, two narratives of Yetzias Mitzrayim. They're telling the story of the children who were squeezed into the walls. Everybody has that story. They're telling the story of the 10 plagues. Everybody has that story. It's in the Torah. Everybody has these stories. So the stories, when they were told with visual effect. Because that's how you effectively communicate, especially to small children. You have to be able to, first of all, you have to tell it in a story. Secondly, some children, they relate to music. So you have songs. Pesach was a night of song. So you sang. Some children, they relate to taste. That's how they learn best. Very small children, the first thing they do, the first fine motor skill is their taste buds. That's why the little kids put everything in their mouth and give their parents heart attacks. And they're putting, because that's how the differentiation comes. So we have sweet wine and bitter herbs and the unique taste of matzah. So the child starts off with tasting. And he hears about different things. So there's songs, and there's drama, and there's role playing, and there's stories. and there's tasting, and this feeling. We pass around the maror, we raise up the maror, this visual aid, we raise the matzah, hey lachmanya, this is the bread, this is what it looked like, this is it. Same thing, hasn't changed. And that's how we tell the story effectively. So all of this is designed to make sure we tell the story effectively. So the Charoset was designed to make the Seder effective. And interestingly enough, don't think this is a rabbinic idea, it's a biblical idea. Because matzah is called lechem oni, and as we learned about a couple of years ago in the Talmud class, and I'm pretty sure the class is available online, we learned about the idea that it's called lechem oni, not from poor or impoverished bread, but from she'onin olav, that you raise your voice over. In other words, you were supposed to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim over the matzah. You're supposed to tell it over the matzah. You're supposed to have the maror on the table. And you're supposed to have the charoset on the table. So when you tell the little children about bricks and mortar in today's day and age, and the kids, he says, I don't know what bricks and mortar is. I never saw bricks and mortar. So you give an example to a small child, like the paste that you see, this paste, this tasty paste, that paste, that was like bricks and mortar. And then you see the red wine, and the child says, what's with the red wine? And you explain to the child about the blood and about the plague. These are visual things for the child to be able to learn and understand. So the Torah asks, Charoset, what is Charoset? He says it's Zecher Latit. It's a remembrance of the clay, of the mortar. Shahaya Aveseinu Mishtabdim Bo. Here we are, 3,338 years later, and we're telling the story. He said, yeah, this is we were building these structures. Lakach tzarech liyes av. That's why it has to be thick. Zecher Latit. That's what the Torah says. That's what the Torah says. But then the Torah says, you should know that Issa b'Yushalmi, it's brought down the Yushalmi, Ista Ovid le Ovev, Ista Ovid le Raka. There are those who make it thin, and that's a Zecher Ladam. So the Torah brings down both opinions. He makes a matter-of-fact statement that the Charoset has to be thick, and then he says there are those who make it thin. He doesn't say that's how you should make the Charoset. He mentions it. He mentions that. When we go to the Shulchan Aruch, to the big Shulchan Aruch, so we see that the Shulchan Aruch says like this: the Charoses Yasa of, you make the Charoses thick, Zecher Latit. And then the Ramos says, this is chapter 473. Then he says, Ula Achar Kain Neistim Boi, after you place some yayin edom, you place red wine, and the reason you do that is Zecher Ladam. So actually we do both. We're doing both. We're making mortar, and then we're liquefying it. Then we're thinning it out. You hear that happened? That's the origin. We have two schools of thought of what the Charoset should represent, either plasma or clay. And then the Shulchan Aruch all of a sudden is telling us we do both. We have the plasma, we have the clay, then we have the plasma. Two separate things. Now it doesn't say when. It doesn't say when in Shulchan Aruch. It just says va'achar kach. Achar kach. When is that? It doesn't say when. It doesn't say when. After. So what's the cutoff point? At what point does this shift? At what point does it change? The Shulchan Aruch doesn't say. Now, in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe speaks about the Charoses, and he says the following. This is in Siman Tafayin Gimel, chapter 473, and I'm reading to you from subsection 20. V'tiknu sheyihiyeh lefonav charoses. The sages ordained that there should be charoset before you. When? B'sha'at amirat ha-Haggadah. At the time when we chant the Haggadah. Why? Because what is the Haggadah if not the story of the slavery and the liberation? So we show the child a Seder plate. Here's the matzah. This is the matzah. This is the matzah we baked in haste because we knew Hashem was going to take us out. We left Egypt before the dough could rise. And we know it's 18 minutes. That's very fast. Wow. And this is the matzah we were eating. And this is the Charoset. So what's Charoset? So we say, mud and clay and making bricks and mortar. Here's your mortar. So we say that the Charoset should be in front of us. B'shat amirat ha'Haggadah sha'charoset hu zecher latit. That's a remembrance of the mud shenishtabdu bo avoseinu b'Mitzrayim, that our ancestors were subjugated in Egypt in these building projects. Lakach tzarich liyos ala shulchan. There's something else here about an apple, which I'm not going to get into. Go back to previous classes, it's all in there. I'm just going to take it to the end of it. Lakach tzarich liyos ala shulchan. That's why it has to be on the table. B'shashem misaper shibud mitzrayim. You tell the story of subjugation. You have to have the visual aid on the table. We're not using it to dip. We don't dip anything in the Charoset yet. If you don't dip anything in the Charoset, why does it have to be on the table? Why do we have to arrange a Seder plate before we start the Seder? And the answer is, we're doing the show and tell. We're placing the items on the Seder plate because the items tell a story. In a visual way. In a literal way. We point our finger to it. The child said, what is this? Oh, very good. It's funny you should ask. We're trying to get the child to ask. We want him to be interested. It becomes a talking point. So you have these things on the table and they become talking points. This is like education 101. This is like the greatest of the of how you educate, how you're able to convey a story in a way that's interesting, in a way that's enchanting, in a way that draws the child in. And it becomes a conversation instead of a monologue. It becomes a dialogue. The child is asking, the parents are responding, the participants around the table start to talk. That's how the Seder is designed. So the maximum amount of possibilities to start conversations. You know, sometimes today when you bring people together socially, they have a thing called icebreakers. Or they have a certain icebreakers. They have a game they play just to get people to start talking a little. And then everybody drinks a little. And it also helps lower inhibition. What happens at the Seder. We have all these icebreakers, all these things, all these little items to have conversations about. And to start the child to have to talk about this, talk about that, talking about things on the table, all of which connect to the story, and everybody's drinking also. Everybody's drinking, so everybody's all of a sudden, their inhibitions are a little lowered. Somebody who's too shy to ask questions suddenly is able to ask questions. Suddenly he's not a great storyteller, and he doesn't excel at drama and presentation. All of a sudden he becomes very articulate. He's very free and easy to speak. Why? He had one cup of wine, another cup of wine, then he has a third cup of wine. By now he's already flying. He's good, This is Charoset. That's Charoset. This is one concept of Charoset. I'm glossing over things purposely because we could sit here till next week. I want to bring things through to you. There's an amazing edited talk of the Rebbe, which is in the 32nd volume of Likkutei Sichos on Chag Pesach. You can look yourself. It's on page 45. The Rebbe bases himself on the words of Maimonides, of the Rambam, and on the words of the Alter Rebbe that I just read for you. And the Rebbe says that there are two dinim, two separate concepts that are attached to Charoset. Two separate rules. Number one, rule one, Hava'ah al ha-shulchan, bringing the Charoset to the table, setting up the Seder plate. That's a part of the story. That's a part of the proceedings type. We set up the Seder plate, we place the Charoset. That's one thing. It should be there at the time of the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. We finished the story already in our studies, right? This is episode 46. We already finished eating matzah, and now we're up to eating maror. All of a sudden, we need the Charoset again. And this time, the second din is that the Charoset becomes a dip. We're going to be dipping the maror in the Charoset. And the truth is, if you were going to dip the maror and the Charoset, it was just for a dip. It didn't need to be there in the beginning. You could have brought it later on. Why was it there in the beginning? Because it's part of the story. So the Charoset has two personalities. It has two separate dinim. There's a din in Charoset that it's part of the story, and then there's another din in Charoset. It's part of the maror.
So the maror is, if it's letters, it's not so maror.
We're going to talk about that soon. We'll touch upon it. I'm not going to go into it very deeply. We're going to touch upon that. I'll touch upon that soon. At any rate, what I want to make very clear to you is that the origin of the Charoset as mortar, as part of the story, that's something that we deal with right in the beginning. Right in the beginning. And it's there on the table, or like the Alter Rebbe says later on, he says that the Charoset is on the table. There's a discussion in Seif Chavav in subsection 26, when you set up the Seder plate, you have to place the things that you're going to be using closest to you. The things you use first. They have this order where you set up the big fork and the small fork. There's a system to it. You use the item that you use first. If people use a knife first, they'll put the spoon. This is all hospitality etiquette, right? So the halacha has a similar kind of etiquette, where the things that are going to be used first are going to be more available. Things that are be used later be less available, right? So we have the Alter Rebbe says that when it comes to the Charoset, that's not really part of the calculation, because einon bo'in ala shulchan ela lezecher ba'alma. The Charoset is initially brought to the table not in a utilitarian way. It's not being used as a food. It's being used as a prop. A prop. It's being used as an element of the storytelling. It's lezecher ba'alma. And because it's lezecher ba'alma, the Alter Rebbe is le'shayach etzlam ma'aviron ala mitzvahs. There's no question of passing over mitzvahs. There's no question. That's what it says. It's there on the table as a zecher ba'alma. Zecher ba'alma means you're telling a story. Now, sorry?
Which Charoset then?
Which Charoset? Which Charoset? So what does it say in the beginning? The beginning of the Charoset should be thick, the mortar. The story is the mortar. In the beginning, we're telling the story of the subjugation, the story of the backbreaking work, the story of the building. The question is actually asked, why mortar of all things? And it says mortar was the most onerous. The most onerous thing they had to do was getting stuck in the mud and in the filth, and that was like the most onerous thing they had to do. They got mired in muck. So that's the first thing that we do. That's the first thing we do. Now something else is going to happen. Something else is going to happen, and that is, we're ready for Maror now. Oh, we're ready for Maror now. Now we have to take the kezayit Maror, and we have to dip it in the Charoset. Now, one second. If you're dipping Maror in the Charoset, what does the Charoset need to be? Thick? Thin. You can dip something in ketchup. You can dip something in mustard. You can't dip it in Jell-O. It's not going to work. You can't dip your potatoes in a potato kugel. It's thick. If it's thick, you can't dip it. You can touch it. You can't dip it. Everybody knows what dip is. Dip means you immerse. Dip is immersion. The only way you can immerse something is if it is liquid. Now comes the second din. Now comes Charoset version 2. Charoset version A is the Charoset which is solid, thick. It represents the mortar. That's the first kind of Charoset. That's mostly a prop. That's a talking piece. Now we come to the Maror, and there's this business of dipping the Maror into the Charoset. But in order to dip it, I can't have solid Maror. Now I need to have liquid. So when in Shulchan Aruch it says, the Ramah says in Shulchan Aruch over here, that the Charoset, you should make it thick like mortar. Later you put the yayin. Later you put. So when would you do that? When you finish telling the story. Right? You look inside the Torah. The Torah starts off by saying, Charoset hu zeicher letit. Fact. It makes a statement. Charoset is mortar. That's what it is. It's talking point. And then he says, but by the way, the Issa b'Yerushalmi, it says in the Yerushalmi, the is the Ovid le Ava, the is the Ovid le Raka. What do you mean Issa b'Yerushalmi? There's both things staying in the Yerushalmi. Because there's different kind of Charoset now. Now Charoset becomes utilitarian. Now Charoset is not simply a talking point. It's not a prop. Now it's actually being used. And this is what the Rebbe says in the Haggadah. So the Rebbe says, "V'koidim hatvila," before you dip it, that's when merachech hacharoset. That's when you make it wet. That's when you make it turn into liquid. And you use the wine. And why using the wine? The Rebbe says, take a look in Siman Tov Ayin Gimel. Now, by the way, in Siman Tov Ayin Gimel, it's very interesting. In Seif Lamed Beis, Lamed Gimel, Lamed Daled, the Alter Rebbe starts off like this. chapter 473 Shulchan Aruch, Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. It says in subsection 32, Charoset tzarich liyis av. The charoset has to be thick, solid. Why? Lefi shehu zeichel letit, because it comes to remind us of the bricks and mortar. Sheshtabdu v'aveseinu. Then later on, all of a sudden you have to create a new version of Charoset. The Charoset goes through an extreme makeover. And from mortar he turns into blood. And we're going to go with the approach of the Zeichel Adam is mainly the Makkah of Dam. Makkah of Dam. Because the Makkah of Dam is Midah Keneged Midah. It's a measure against a measure. So yes, it recalls what they did to our babies, but that's not the focus. The focus is not the suffering. The focus is the moment of liberation. That's the beginning of redemption. So remembering the blood. And therefore the Rebbe adds, V'yesh l'rachachai b'mashke odoim. It should be red. He says either using vinegar, chaymetz, or yayin adumim, or red wine. See where they got that from? That's where the Mamdanis of yesteryear got that from. See? They said, aha, yayin adumim, dam, it's in there. Look at this. Look at this, said Tucker Carlson. Right here. It's mamish right here. It's blood. It says blood. Yeah, it doesn't say anything about blood. It says it's a zecher. Don't zecher me. Now you're just giving explanation. I know what it says. I saw it. I read it myself in the book.
So the blood represents the lowest point. That's where it started.
The blood represents the beginning of the makot. And incidentally, once the makot started, they weren't working anymore. Everything changed. It was a process of redemption.
But then why do you have
So then the Alter Rebbe goes on to describe the details of what goes into the Charoset. It's based on the Tosfos. And then the Alter Rebbe says, what happens if Pesach falls on Shabbos? This is a problem. Because on Shabbos, you're not supposed to make a mixture. There's something solid into liquid. Oh, we got a problem here. Here we're looking for an extreme makeover, but on Shabbos you're not supposed to do that. Says the Alter Rebbe, Mchol Pesach b'Shabbos. If Pesach's on Shabbat, then Tzarech Lizoher. You have to be a little more careful, right? So what do? So what you do is Yerachachai b'Shabbos ha'yidei shinu. You do it through a change. And we're going to see that instead you have the wine, instead of adding wine to the Charoset, instead we have the wine that's there. As you're going to see, the Rebbe says you use the plate underneath the becher, you pick up the Kiddush cup, the 4 glasses, there's wine that spills, you're supposed to spill wine. The wine spills over, and then the wine that spills over, you add a little Charoset into that wine and you mix it around with your finger. With a shinui. Right? Which if you know Hilchos Shabbos, that's how you, when it comes to making cereal, pouring the kids cereal on Shabbos. On Shabbos you put the milk first, and then you put the cornflakes on top instead of the other way around. Same kind of idea. First you put the wine. But the bottom line is, it's very clear that there has to be this transformation. You have to shift. You have to shift it. Where it goes from a solid and a representation of mortar into a plasma-like substance. Incidentally, there are those who have a custom of using dates, but the dates are problematic because the dates you can't make them very thin. If you take apples or pears and almonds and you chop it up, so yeah, it's much easier to turn it into a liquid, but dates don't turn into liquid. That's a problem, right? That's why we prefer to use this other. So it's not a paste because paste doesn't turn into liquid. But the charoset, which is just a bunch like literally looks almost like mortar, right? It's like cement that you can make very thin. Now this is also, by the way, articulated. There's a Tosfos. The Tosfos says that the Tosfos talks about the concept of the Charoset, and the Gemara in the Talmud Bavli also speaks about tzarich l'simuchi v'tzarich l'kiyui, that we have 2 different needs in the Charoset. We're looking for an acidic liquid, it says, and we're looking for a certain thickness. So the Tosfos and Daf Kuf Tez Zayin, Amud Aleph says, Ubi Yerushalmi Omer, in the Yerushalmi it says that it's made as a Zeichel Adam. The Zeichel Adam it's not brought down in the Bavli. Bavli talks about Kiyu, it talks about being acidic. We'll soon talk about why that's necessary. But the Talmud Yerushalmi talks about the idea of making it like blood, and pashtos, like it's for the makkah of dam. And that's why we say we dip the maror into the charoset. And the Tosfos says, v'chein amod debar, that this is very common, l'simuchi, to make it thick, says the Tosfos, u'b'shas achila, but at the time when it comes to eat it, mekalshin oisei b'yayin v'chemetz, that's when you make it thin. That's what the Tosfos says. This is the Middle Ages. So the Tosfos clearly says, when is the time to make it thin? When it doesn't serve a purpose of being a show and tell piece, but when it becomes an edible thing. So how is it edible? It's edible as something to dip the maror in. Now becomes the question, when we dip the maror in, how deep do you dip? And what is the purpose of this dip? Right? How does this work? So here's where it gets really, really interesting. Because the language that's used in the Torah for the dipping of the maror, that it says, the Torah says, Yikach kezayit maror, v'yishko'enu kulo b'charoses. The maror goes to the mikveh. A full dip. Okay, so you got lots of wine there. You take the maror and you immerse it in the charoses. The only way you could do that if it's thin, if it's going to be thick, you're not going to be able to immerse it. You immerse it in the charoses. Now, in case you're thinking, I don't remember doing that. You don't. That's true. We'll talk about that in a minute. But that's what it says in the Torah. But the Torah says, don't leave it in there too long. Don't leave it in there too long. The maror does a quick dip, a quick mikveh. Put it in and take it out. Lo yeshana b'teiche. Why not? Because how does charoset usually taste? Sweet. And how does maror usually taste? Bitter. If you put the bitter in the sweet for a very long time, what will the bitter taste like? Sweet. Right? Ask the kids who dump their French fries in the ketchup, which is 80% sugar. Little secret, nobody tells anybody. It's not tomatoes, it's sugar. If you took a bottle of ketchup and you want to know how much sugar, the content of sugar is approximately 80%. Crazy. It's crazy. That stuff is poison. That's why the kids love it. Nobody's take French fries and put them in chocolate syrup. Or mustard. So you put them in ketchup and it's filled with sugar. So you take this thing, you dip it in there, and then you take it out. And the Torah says, you know why you do that? This is the reason Rabbeinu Yoina said that after you dip, what's the next thing you do? You shake. You dip and then you shake. Why are you shaking? Because we don't want the taste of the bitter maror to be eclipsed by the sweet taste of the wine and the charoses. So then why are we dipping it? And if you don't want to lose the taste of the charoset, then don't dip it. Because if you dip it, you're going to end up losing the taste. It's a good question. What is this dipping all about? So even though we're up to the shake already, we still didn't figure out the dip. We're just understanding what the charoset is. We don't have clarity as to what the dip is about. Now, if you take a look in the Shulchan Aruch, it says that you go to Siman Tov Ayin Hey. Pardon me. It says you take the kazayas of maror, and the language of the Shulchan Aruch is v'yishka enu kulo. Immerse it. Complete immersion. I know you're looking like, what? I never did that. Wait a minute. Good question. But the Shulchan Aruch says, lo yishana b'teiche. Don't pickle it. Don't leave it there. Quick dip. Shlei is batal tam merirose. Umitam zeh, and for this very reason, tzarech lenar charoset malav. That's why we got to shake off the charoset. What's going on over here? Then why did I dip it to begin with? Dip it and shake it off. So don't dip it. Make up your mind, mister. What do you want to do here? You want to dip it in charoset, or you want to have bitter maror? You want to have your cake and eat it too. You want to be wet and dry at the same time. You want to be bitter and sweet. What's going on here? So, in the language of the Maharil, by the way, in Sefer Maharil, it says, "V'yivarach halachilas maror terem yishka'enu," before you put it in the charoset. It also talks about full immersion in the charoset. Yishka'enu toch charoset be'omek, deep. Go for a deep dive, like in a deep end. You got like a serious bowl full of wine over here, real plasma. But lo yeshenu, and then you got to take it off. Why? Shelo yehi davuk by charoset. Shouldn't be stuck to it, because that will be levatal tamamar. Very interestingly, the Alter Rebbe, when he starts to talk about the Charoset, in Sim Tafayin Hey, he also speaks about, he says, V'yishka'enu kulo. If Yud Aleph, he says, Yishka'enu kulo. And he says, what's the reason for this? K'dei lahames es kafa, to kill the kafa. Now the kafa is usually translated as worms, which makes absolutely no sense. Because if there are worms in the maror, dead worms are also prohibited. And anyway, if you put wine, they go for a little dip in the maror, in the wine, and then you're going to have dead worms to eat. What does that mean, kafa? Rashi says min tolas. It's a kind of bug. So this is something that I spoke about. I think it was 2 years ago in Tom's Talmudish, and I encourage you to go back and watch it because it was I thought a really great class. The bottom line is I figured out that we're talking here about salmonella. We're talking here about listeria. We're talking here about bacteria. How do you kill bacteria? How did they kill bacteria in ancient times? With acid. Acidic. It says chaymitz yayin. So you take the maror. It was very common for fresh green vegetables to have listeria. Today it's much less common because of refrigeration. But once upon a time, it was extremely common. And a lot of people did not eat fresh green vegetables. They would pickle the vegetables. They would cook it or pickle it. They would not eat a fresh vegetable. But this is a problem for a number of reasons. It doesn't work for the maror. If you cook the maror, it's not maror anymore. In fact, the halacha says cooked maror is not maror. So we need to have fresh vegetables. But it's going to be dangerous over here. So what do you do? The answer is you make sure to kill the bacteria. How do you kill the bacteria? In the vinegar or the wine, in the acid, the tart acidic taste kills the bacteria. But the Rebbe says, Achshav, now, ein noegim l'shakei kulai. If you were by a Seder where they were dipping the maror in the Charoset, that would be very unusual. Because for the most part, nobody does that anymore. What do? We do a slight dip, a little dip. Not a big dipper, a little dipper. And we do it. Why is that? Those who explain this. We don't have this extreme listeria that they had in the Middle East at the time. It's not common today. Yeah, every once in a while there's like an outbreak. And they tell you, no, don't eat the vegetables or fruit. You hear it on the news every couple of years. But as a rule, we don't know about this today. So then why are we dipping it into the Charoset? Says the Alter Rebbe, ve'ein matbilin b'charoset elo mishum mitzvah shehu zecher latit. Very good, because it's the remembrance of the mortar. However, if it's going to be mortar, how are we going to be able to dip? You can't dip it. You can touch it to charoset, but you're not going to be able to dip it in charoset. So once upon a time, they had to have a lot of wine and have a lot of liquid and immerse the maror into the vinegar or the wine to kill the bacteria. Then you shake it off. So now we know why we're dipping it. We're dipping it because we got to kill the bacteria. We're shaking it off because we don't want to lose the taste of maror. But in today's day and age, we're only using the charoset because it's a remembrance of the bitter things. What was the bitter things? The bitter thing was the way we suffered. And because we're remembering how we used to eat this bitter maror, as we learned last week, because of the time of the Beis HaMikdash. So that's why we are going to be dipping it into the maror. Now, this idea, by the way, that the Alter Rebbe speaks about in Shulchan Aruch, comes from the Pri Chodesh. The Pri Chodesh says, Anu lo nohagnu l'shako kulo. Pri Chodesh is like 16th century. He says, 17th century. He said, we don't immerse it. It's not our custom anymore. I don't know anybody who immerses it, actually. We don't immerse it. And he says that, and this is why the Rif and the Rambam don't mention the immersion. They don't mention the immersion. They don't say that. Because we stopped doing this. We don't have this kapha anymore. We don't have this bacteria.
Why do we stop doing it if it was the story?
So then, umasha anu meviyim charoset al shulchan. Then why are we bringing the charoset to the table? And the answer is b'shum dekaimelan. We learn like Rebbe Lezer Bar Tzaddik in Psachim and the Bavli Daf Kuf Yudalad, and that's because of mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? Mitzvah is it reminds us of the tit. Now that you know the history and the background, now let's go back to what the Rebbe says. Koydem hatvila merachach charoset beyayin. But you don't need to have a bowl of charoset. You don't need a whole bunch of liquid to dip or immerse the maror inside. You don't need that anymore. So what do you need now? Just a little bit of dip, a small dip. Ve'ein, says the Alter Rebbe, the Rebbe says, ein mashke kol ha-kezayis becharoset. We don't take the whole kezayis of maror and immerse it into the charoset. We don't have this mintalas. We don't have these little bugs. We don't have this bacteria today. The maror can maybe be shas like it was in the days of the Gemara. Ve'ein matbilim becharoset elo mishum zecher letit. That's the only reason. And here the Alter Rebbe cites the Pri Chodesh and the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Now comes the big question. The big question is this. I understand that maror has two personalities. Maror is a zecher, maror is a remembrance, as a talking piece. I understand that maror is a part of the charoset is a part of the maror. It's part of the maror. The maror, I have to eat it. Before it was a show and tell, and then from show and tell, from pointing to something, then we eat it. It's a different level of learning. That's how children learn. Some children learn through the taste buds. So we're going to eat it. So if we're going to eat it, but there was another reason we used to dip it in the maror. We dipped the maror in the charoset. What was the other reason we dipped it? Because of health and safety. But the health and safety doesn't exist anymore. But here is the big question that remains. There are many, many examples in Judaism where even though a particular injunction was made for a certain reason, and the reason no longer exists, we continue to do the observance. We don't change it. For example, washing our hands at the end of a meal called mayim acharonim, because there used to be something called sodomite salt. So the question that remains here is, if we used to immerse the maror into the charoset because it was dangerous, but the maror in the charoset is not only because of danger, but also because it's a remembrance, so why don't we still immerse it the same way? Why would we change the practice? If this is the way they used to do it, even if the reasons changed, after all, it's still maror, it's still charoset, it still has the same idea. So why wouldn't we continue to immerse it? It's actually a shocking thing. Why did we change? Why did we change from the old custom of immersion, and now we only do a little dip? So you're going to say, well, we don't need to anymore. And I'm going to tell you, there's a lot of things like that in Yiddishkeit, where we continue to do the custom. But here we change the custom. Do you understand the question? This is a huge question. Nobody asked this question. Everybody just takes it, oh yeah, we don't have to dip it anymore. It's not necessary, so we don't dip it anymore. But the question is, why not? Says the Rebbe, v'adif, and here the Rebbe emphasizes, italicizes the word v'adif. V'adif, it's better shalei l'shkoya kulei. It's better not to do the full immersion. Why is it better not to do the full immersion? That's what they used to do. Because the immersion was always problematic. You immersed it in the maror because you were worried about health and safety, bacteria. But what did you have to do right after you dipped? You had to shake. Why do you have to shake? Because we were afraid of taking away the taste. So the Rebbe says that's the reason that since we don't have to immerse it now, it's better not to immerse it now. Because the maror has to taste like bitter herbs. And because the maror has to taste like bitter herbs, well, 1 second, but we still want him to have a dip. Yes, we want to have a dip. Why do we want to have a dip? Because what does the dip do? It reminds us of the tit, it reminds us of the mud, it reminds us of the dam also. So there's a reason to use it. It doesn't have to add taste, a little bit of taste. For the most part, the maror is still bitter. A little bit of sweet charoset. But the charoset just complements the maror or contrasts the maror. It doesn't eclipse or overwhelm the maror. That's the chiddush here in the Rebbe's comment. The Rebbe says, "Va'adiv shalei lishkaya." It's better not to make a big dip, because the dip was always problematic. The dip always posed the danger of losing the bitterness, which is why we had to do the shake. So you're going to say, so in today's day and age, when we're not really doing a big dip, why do we have to do a shake? What's the answer? Because that's the way it was. That was the custom. The custom is after the dip we do the shake. And by the way, we make sort of shake off the maror so taka doesn't take away the taste of the maror at all. So what's the purpose then of dipping it? I asked you the question at the beginning of the class. Why should I dip it if I'm going to shake it off? Why do I have to dip it for? And the answer is because by virtue of dipping it, now the children said, here is the maror that reminds us of the bitter taste. Here is the charoset that reminds us of the mud, of the mortar. And we made it even now, we liquefied it, and we made it like plasma. It reminds us of makas dam. You see, kindalach, you see? Now we take the maror, the bitter herbs, which reminds us of the bitter time. We didn't get depressed, we got bitter. The big difference, as I talked about in a much, much earlier class. The bitterness, out of depression you go to sleep, out of bitterness you get out of bed. We were bitter about our situation. We decided to cry out to Hashem. So you have the bitterness, and you have the representation of the tit, of the muck, of the mud, of the mortar, and you also have the representation of the blood. But you don't have to taste it. You don't need to immerse it anymore. So I dip it in and I shake it off. And whatever little bit of taste is left over there, that's enough to be a reminder, enough to help me understand the story. The Rebbe says, Kain efsher loimer. We may say this. In other words, the Rebbe is saying, what he's saying is a big chiddush. It's a big chiddush. It's a novelty. It doesn't say this. It doesn't say this. The Rebbe didn't see this anywhere. But he said, it seems reasonable to me to say this. This is a reasonable thing to say. Because we have a concern of shaking it off. Because we were shaking it off because we're worried that it's going to take away from the taste. So therefore we dip it a little. We do make it, we liquefy. So we have the idea of the Talmud Yerushalmi of the dam as well. And then we shake it off because we want to emphasize the taste of the maror. And therefore we covered all our bases. Now it makes sense. Now you use the charoset for the maror. In the sandwich, we use the dry charoset. We only use the wet charoset when we eat the plain maror. But when we get into the korech, if you're careful not to make your matzah wet, we don't dip the korech into the wet. We put it into the dry. In fact, the Rebbe said that he saw by his father-in-law, the Rebbe's father-in-law would take a knife and he would just like smear a little bit of the, he would dip, just smear it a little bit on the leaves. So the dipping takes place when you're eating the actual maror, not in the sandwich. And that now we understand the rest. What does it say in Pesachim Daf Kuftes Vav Beis? The Gemara says over there clearly that we're concerned with, on Kuftes Vav Beis, we say we are concerned with losing the bitterness of the maror. One second. This one's. So once we dip it in the maror, we'll be in tam maror v'leka. We're afraid what the Gemara says. We have to shake it off because we're afraid it's going to take away from the taste of the maror. When do we start using the horseradish? So this is a whole separate discussion about how the maror works. We use the horseradish and the lettuce. We use both. But this is the reason why we shake it off. Now comes the last point of the class. What should I be thinking about at the bracha? The next thing the Alter Rebbe says is the word v'yivarech. And you make a bracha. What bracha do you make? Asher kedishano b'mitzvotav etzivano ala chilat maror. When I make the bracha asher kedishano b'mitzvotav etzivano ala chilat maror, what should I be thinking about? I should be thinking about the mitzvah of eating maror. Says the Alter Rebbe, tzarech iyun. This is actually quite surprising. Mashaloi hetek mashakasav b'Shulchan Aruch. The Alter Rebbe doesn't mention what he says in Shulchan Aruch in chapter 475 in subsection 18, in paragraph 18. Because over there, the Alter Rebbe explains that the maror sandwich, the korech, is because we don't know what the best way to eat maror is. We don't know how the Chachamim would have ordained the maror. What did they eat the maror like in the time of the Beis HaMikdash? Did they eat the maror together with the matzah and the korban Pesach, or did they eat them one after the other? Did they eat them on the same plate, so to speak? No, we don't know. There's a machlekes between Hillel and Chaverov, and we don't know what the halacha is. So when we have our maror today, which is made as a tiknu zeicher lemigdash, says the Alter Rebbe, we don't know, should the maror be eaten just plain maror, zeicher lemigdash, or should the maror be eaten with matzah? And what's the answer? We have two marors, maror A and maror B. Maror plain and maror with the matzah. And the Alter Rebbe says, because l'nifsik halacha, like a Hillel, like a Chaverov, because we don't have clarity, we never had a ruling. So lefikach lotzes yidei shneim, to fulfill both schools of thought. Tzarech adam sheyechel kazayas matzah bilvad. The first thing you got to do is eat a kazayas of matzah, and you eat that b'loy maror, as we learned in our previous Gemara class, in the last Gemara class. You can't have mixing of maror matzah. Matzah's got to be matzah. That's a mitzvah min Torah. You make a bracha al achilas matzah. And when you make the bracha al achilas matzah, you for sure fulfill your mitzvah of eating matzah, according to everybody, according to Hillel also, because this is a mitzvah to eat matzah. Then you eat a kazayat of maror alone to fulfill Hillel's chaverim, the opinion of Hillel's peers. And so they fulfill the mitzvah of maror. And then after that, then you eat another kazayas of maror. And this I eat with a kazayas of matzah. And that's a zeicher lemigdash, but this is a zeicher lemigdash kehillel. So actually there's two marors. And you don't make a bracha on the kricha, and you don't make a bracha on the matzah. However, says the Alter Rebbe, tzarech lizor shlichasiach, when you make a bracha on the matzah, what should you be thinking of? You should be thinking of the sandwich. And when you make a bracha on the maror, what should you be thinking of? You're thinking of the sandwich. Because the bracha goes on both. The bracha of the matzah also includes the rabbinic matzah, which is eaten with the maror. And the bracha of the maror also includes the other version of the maror. And if you go back earlier, the Alter Rebbe's instructions, when he says to make a bracha on the matzah, he says, v'yichaven, you should have in mind, lifter gamkin achilas hakricha, to have in mind the sandwich, which is going to be used, the third matzah. And you should also have in mind the eating of the afikoman. And here the Alter Rebbe doesn't say anything. Here it doesn't tell us v'yichaven. So the Rebbe says tzarech iyun. This is very, very surprising. The Alter Rebbe himself says that we should have in mind the korech. V'chein min hagenu, and that is what we do. That we actually do this. Shetzarech lechaven lifter bebracha zu gam maror shebekorech. When you make the bracha al achilat maror, you're supposed to be having in mind what? The maror, the bitter herbs, with nothing but charoset. And then also have in mind the sandwich, which is why you're not supposed to speak in between. A lot of people don't know this. They sit at the table, they sit talking. When it comes to the mitzvahs, shut down the conversation, do the mitzvahs. That's what you got to do. The matzah has to be eaten. You got to do it in 6 minutes. Get the matzah done. Get the maror done. 6, 7 minutes max. So you got to just do it. You get a bag of matzah, straight into the maror. After the maror, straight into the korech. Then you can breathe. Now, of course, you could ask the question, why don't we make a bracha on the Charoset? Why don't we make a bracha on the Charoset? So this is a whole discussion about this. And the answer is that we don't make a bracha on the Charoset because the Charoset is only there playing a side role to the maror. Just like you don't make a bracha if you're eating French fries, you don't make a bracha on the ketchup. You don't make a shahakol on the ketchup and a hadama on the French fries, because it's only there as a tafel. It's only there as secondary. So even though the Maror plays a role, not on an edible level, it plays a role on the level of we're using it as part of the story, but it doesn't play a role in what we're going to call in a level of birchas hanen and a level of making a bracha. And it actually isn't a mitzvah. There is no bracha. We don't hold that it's a mitzvah as a mitzvah to eat a kazayas of Charoset. So the kazayas of the Charoset is a talking piece. The Charoset is a thing that we augment or use to enhance the message of the Maror, but in the Charoset itself we don't make a bracha. However, the Rebbe is very clear, even though it doesn't say it in the instructions, when we make the bracha on the Maror, we have in mind Maror point 2 as well. Now, the next thing we're going to try to understand is the last piece in this mechanics of bitterness. And this is going to be Be'ezrat Hashem. We'll talk more about the Maror and the Charoset, why we don't make a bracha on that. But we have, the Alter Rebbe uses the words v'yivarech, and he says, bracha zu, this blessing, the blessing of bitterness. So the next, the third and the final part of speaking about this idea of the blessings, be the blessings of bitterness. The blessing of bitterness, that will, with Hashem's help, be our next episode. We'll conclude the mechanics of bitterness, and we'll be able to move on to the next, the text of the bracha. But I don't know if we'll finish the text also. We might have to do that at a later time. But at any rate, the next episode will certainly be about the blessings on bitterness. All right? And with this, we have now concluded today's little episode. Shkoyach! Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you for being here in person. Shkoyach. Thank you for joining online. I hope you found this class sweet. And the main thing is, Hashem should help us that this year we should be eating Pesach, Matzah, and Maror after the coming of Mashiach already. And that should be B'mheiro, be Ameinu, Amen. Shekoyach, Shekoyach. Thank you for joining. Please share. If you aren't yet, please subscribe. Bye, Latov.
So when you do the